Hi, I'm Gabrielle Berry. I walked into my art studio one morning to find my husband and business partner auctioning off my paintings to pay for his gambling debts. "She'll never notice," he laughed to the buyer. "Artists live in their own world anyway." That's when I stepped out of the shadows and whispered, "Actually, I see everything." Ever been invisible in your own life until the moment you decided to become unforgettable? Before we dive in, tell me where you're listening from and who's the person in your life who sees you when others look right through you. I pulled into the studio parking lot at 6:47 a.m., earlier than usual because sleep had abandoned me around 3. The October air bit through my cardigan as I fumbled for the gallery keys, hands stiff from another restless night of painting. The Riverside Arts District was still quiet, coffee shops not yet glowing with morning rush, just the distant hum of delivery trucks and my footsteps echoing off wet pavement. The morning felt different, charged with the kind of electric tension that comes before thunderstorms. I'd been having that feeling more often lately, like standing on the edge of a cliff without knowing how far the drop went. Maybe it was the dreams that kept waking me, fragments of conversations I couldn't quite remember, faces that seemed familiar but wrong somehow. Something felt off the moment I turned the key. The security alarm didn't chirp its usual greeting. Instead, I heard voices drifting from the back studio, low and urgent. Donovan's laugh, the one he used when he was nervous, punctuated by a woman's clipped tone I didn't recognize. I eased the door shut behind me, slipping off my flats so my steps wouldn't announce me on the polished concrete floors. The main gallery stretched ahead, morning light filtering through tall windows onto walls that should have held my latest collection. Instead, empty hooks jutted like accusations from pristine white spaces. My breath caught. 23 pieces. I'd hung 23 paintings just 2 weeks ago for the autumn showing. Now I counted 7. The rest had vanished like smoke, leaving only faint rectangular shadows on the white walls where they'd protected the paint from fading. My heart hammered as I crept toward the studio. Through the half-open door, I glimpsed Donovan gesturing at an easel, his salt and pepper hair catching the fluorescent light. Beside him stood a woman in a tailored navy suit, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun. Between them, propped against the wall like suspects in a lineup, were 6 of my paintings. But something was wrong with them. The colors seemed flatter somehow, the brushstrokes too uniform. I'd spent 15 years developing my technique, learning to layer paint in ways that created depth and texture. These looked mechanical. "The brushwork is exceptional," the woman said, adjusting wire-rimmed glasses. "Are you certain she won't notice the originals are missing?" Donovan's laugh made my stomach clench. Artists live in their own world anyway. Gabrielle's so focused on the next piece, she barely remembers what she finished last month. Besides, he tapped his temple, she's been having those episodes lately. Memory issues. Gets confused about dates, names, where she put things. I pressed against the doorframe, blood rushing in my ears. Episodes. The only confusion I'd experienced was wondering why I felt so foggy after my morning coffee lately, why simple tasks seemed harder than they should. Like yesterday, when I'd stood in front of my easel for 10 minutes trying to remember which painting I'd been working on. "The documentation looks authentic," the woman continued, flipping through a manila folder. "Certificate of authenticity, gallery provenance, insurance appraisals. Though I must say, if your wife is truly as compromised as you suggest, perhaps she should be in professional care." "We're working on that," Donovan replied smoothly. "My sister Penelope handles the legal side. Should have conservatorship finalized within the month. Once that's in place, we can manage all her affairs properly." Conservatorship. The word hit like ice water. I gripped the doorframe harder, watching this stranger examine my work like livestock at auction. These weren't just paintings. They were pieces of my soul, hours of struggle and breakthrough, the visual diary of everything I couldn't say in words. My eyes focused on the canvas. The woman held a painting I'd completed just 2 months ago. A portrait of storm clouds breaking over wheat fields, painted during the worst of my grief after Mom died. I'd worked on it for 6 weeks, building layers of pain and hope in equal measure. But this version looked wrong. The clouds were the right shape but lacked the subtle variations in gray that had taken me days to perfect. The wheat moved in the wrong direction. This one particularly, The woman lifted the canvas higher. The emotional depth is remarkable. Such tragedy in the brushstrokes. Gabrielle's always been good at playing the tortured artist, Donovan said dismissively. Makes for better sales. Collectors eat up that authentic suffering narrative. His words cut deeper than expected. Every late night I'd spent painting through grief, every session where I'd pushed through doubt and frustration, every moment I'd poured genuine emotion onto canvas he reduced to marketing strategy. The market for contemporary emotional realism is quite strong, the woman agreed. These pieces should fetch between 15 and 20,000 each at auction. My legs nearly gave out. 15,000? Donovan had been telling me the gallery was struggling, that we needed to price my work modestly to move inventory. The last pieces I'd sold had gone for 3,000 each, and he'd made me feel grateful for that. What about the artist herself? The woman asked. Won't she eventually notice the financial discrepancies? Handled, Donovan said with the confidence of someone who'd thought this through. I manage all the books. Gabrielle thinks these pieces sold for much less. The difference goes toward gallery expenses, debt service, operating costs. She's never questioned it. Because I'd trusted him. For 7 years of marriage, I'd trusted him to handle the business side while I focused on creating. He'd presented himself as my protector in a cutthroat art world, the practical mind that would keep me safe from exploitation. And if she becomes suspicious? She won't, Donovan said firmly. But if she does, we have documentation of her mental decline. Doctor visits, prescription records, witness statements about her confusion and memory loss. Penelope's already filed preliminary paperwork. That was my breaking point. I stepped into the doorway, voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. Actually, I see everything. The woman startled, nearly dropping my painting. Donovan's face drained of color, his practiced charm cracking like old paint. Gabrielle, he stammered. You're early. I thought you were visiting Professor Whitmore this morning. I was, I said, advancing into the room. But it seems I should have been here instead, watching my husband auction off my life's work to pay his gambling debts. The woman cleared her throat delicately. Perhaps I should return another time. No, I said firmly. Stay. I'd like to hear more about my apparent mental incompetence and need for professional care. Donovan's jaw tightened, the mask slipping further. You're being dramatic. These are just business arrangements. You don't understand the financial pressures. I understand that you've been selling my originals and replacing them with reproductions, I interrupted, moving closer to examine the canvas on the easel. I understand that you've been lying about sale prices. And I understand that you've been drugging my coffee to make me appear confused. The woman's eyes widened. Donovan's face went from pale to gray. That's ridiculous, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, I said. Now that I've stopped drinking the coffee you so thoughtfully prepared every morning. The gallery fell silent except for the hum of track lighting. I walked to the easel where my storm cloud painting waited, running fingers along the frame I'd built myself. The wood felt different, smoother, machine-cut rather than hand-shaped. Tell me, I said to the woman, when you authenticate artwork, do you check for ultraviolet reactive signatures? She blinked rapidly. What? I moved to the light switch, flicking on the UV blacklight I'd installed for photography work. Under the purple glow, nothing happened to the canvas. No hidden signatures, no authentication codes, just flat paint that absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. Every authentic Gabrielle Berry piece contains UV-reactive elements, I said calmly. It's a security measure I learned from my mentor. The reproductions you've been selling? They don't have these signatures. Which makes them forgeries. I moved to the storage cabinet and pulled out a canvas I'd completed last week, one that hadn't yet made it to the gallery walls. Under the UV light, my initials blazed in the corner, along with a date code and microscopic symbols I'd developed over years of study with Professor Whitmore. The woman set down her folder with shaking hands. I had no idea. The documentation seemed legitimate. The documentation is legitimate, I agreed. For the originals, which are currently hanging in private collections, sold without my knowledge or consent. The pieces you've been purchasing and reselling? Those were worthless reproductions. Donovan stepped forward, his mask finally slipping completely. You think you're so clever, don't you? But who's going to believe you over a licensed dealer and a medical professional? Penelope has Dr. Harmon ready to testify about your declining mental state. One signature on the conservatorship papers, and all of this becomes mine to manage as I see fit. My smile felt foreign after months of self-doubt. That might be a problem. Why? Because Professor Whitmore isn't just an art professor. He's a former authentication expert for the Metropolitan Museum. And for the past 6 months, he's been teaching me advanced forensic art analysis while documenting every conversation I've had with you and Penelope. The blood drained from Donovan's face completely. That's impossible. The old man has dementia. He can barely remember his own name. Actually, a gravelly voice spoke from the gallery entrance. My memory is quite sharp. I just find it useful to let people underestimate me. We turned to see Professor Whitmore walking slowly but steadily into the studio, his usual wheelchair nowhere in sight. Behind him followed a woman in a dark suit and a man with a camera bag slung over his shoulder. Ms. Berry, Whitmore said with a slight nod, I believe you've met my former colleague, Detective Morrison from the Art Fraud Division. The woman who'd been examining my paintings began backing toward the window. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Detective Morrison said firmly, I'm going to need you to stay put. We have some questions about the sale of forged artwork and your role in what appears to be a coordinated fraud scheme. Donovan looked between Whitmore and the detective, desperation creeping into his voice. This is harassment. You can't prove anything. Gabrielle's mentally unstable. Mr. Berry, Detective Morrison interrupted, we have 6 months of recorded conversations, documented evidence of art forgery, and medical records showing traces of benzodiazepine in your wife's system without a prescription. Would you like to explain how anxiety medication ended up in her morning coffee? The room spun slightly as the implications hit. Benzodiazepine? Lorazepam, specifically, Whitmore said gently. Enough to cause confusion and memory issues, but not enough to be immediately dangerous. Classic tactics for someone trying to establish mental incompetence. I sank into the chair by my easel, legs suddenly unsteady. Months of doubting myself, wondering if I was losing my mind, questioning my own perceptions. All orchestrated by the man who'd promised to love and protect me. The coffee, I whispered, understanding flooding through me. Every morning, you'd have it ready before I came downstairs. Said it was your way of taking care of me. French press, Donovan had always said proudly. The only way to properly extract the oils. But it wasn't about the coffee. It was about the control, the ritual that let him dose me precisely, day after day, until I began to doubt my own mind. Detective Morrison opened her notepad. Ms. Berry, we'll need you to provide detailed documentation of every piece that's been sold without your knowledge. Professor Whitmore has already given us a preliminary list, but we'll need your confirmation. I nodded, mind clearing like morning fog burning off the bay. There's more. In the storage room behind the studio, I keep detailed photos and sketches of every piece I complete. Dimensions, color palettes, brushstroke analysis. It's all documented. Excellent, Whitmore said, pride evident in his voice. I told you that attention to detail would serve you well. The investigation that followed revealed the staggering scope of the operation. Over the past 2 years, Donovan had systematically replaced 47 of my original paintings with high-quality reproductions. The originals had been sold through a network of private dealers and auction houses for a total of over $800,000. I'd received payment for exactly none of it. The reproduction operation was sophisticated, involving a forger in Chicago who specialized in contemporary works. The forgeries were good enough to fool casual inspection but lacked the subtle technical elements that made each piece unique. My layered painting technique, developed over years of experimentation, created microscopic variations that were impossible to replicate mechanically. But more than the financial theft, the psychological manipulation had been calculated and cruel. The morning coffee ritual had started 6 months after our wedding, presented as a loving gesture. The benzodiazepine dosing began gradually, increasing as Donovan grew bolder with his scheme. The drug levels were precisely calibrated, the toxicologist explained during the investigation. Enough to impair short-term memory and cause confusion, but not enough to incapacitate or raise obvious red flags. Someone with medical knowledge helped plan this. That someone turned out to be Dr. Marcus Harmon, Penelope's boyfriend and a practicing psychiatrist who'd been building a case for my mental incompetence. His notes described a patient exhibiting classic signs of early-onset dementia, complete with fabricated incidents and forged test results. The conservatorship papers were already prepared, requiring only a judge's signature to grant Donovan complete control over my person and assets. Under the proposed arrangement, I would have been declared mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs, effectively erasing my legal identity as an autonomous adult. It's elder abuse tactics applied to a younger victim, Detective Morrison explained. The pattern is identical: isolate the target, undermine their confidence, establish a pattern of dependency, then take legal control. Your age made you an unusual target, but your success as an artist made you a valuable one. The network extended beyond my case. Helena Voss, the woman who'd been examining my paintings, had been operating similar schemes across 3 states. Her clients were typically artists whose work was gaining value but who lacked business sophistication or strong support networks. We've identified 17 other victims so far, Morrison continued. The pattern is always the same: befriend the artist or their spouse, gradually take over the business relationship, replace originals with forgeries, then gaslight the victim into questioning their own perceptions. Donovan's gambling addiction had been the catalyst but not the cause. Financial records showed he'd been embezzling from the gallery almost from the beginning, initially just skimming small amounts from sales. The gambling debts had accelerated the timeline, forcing him to become more aggressive and systematic. Penelope's role had been crucial to the legal aspects. As an attorney, she'd provided the framework for the conservatorship strategy while maintaining plausible deniability. Her law firm had a pattern of representing elderly clients in questionable guardianship arrangements, always with family members who stood to benefit financially. The storage room behind the studio became a crime scene as investigators catalogued evidence. My documentation system, developed under Professor Whitmore's guidance, proved crucial to establishing the scope of the fraud. Every painting I'd completed over the past 5 years was photographed from multiple angles, with detailed notes about materials, techniques, and timeline. I'd sketched preliminary versions, documented color mixing formulas, and maintained a digital archive of work-in-progress shots. "This is extraordinary," the lead investigator said, examining my files. "I've never seen an artist document their process so thoroughly." "Professor Whitmore taught me that memory fades but evidence endures," I replied. "I thought I was just being organized. I didn't realize I was building a legal case." The UV signature system proved to be the key breakthrough. Over the past 3 years, I'd been embedding ultraviolet reactive elements in every piece, using techniques Whitmore had learned during his authentication work at major museums. The signatures were invisible under normal light but blazed under UV examination. Each piece contained my initials, the completion date, and a unique identification code that corresponded to my documentation files. The forgeries contained none of these elements. "The forger is technically skilled," Whitmore explained as we examined side-by-side comparisons. "But he's reproducing surface elements without understanding the underlying structure. Your technique involves building layers in specific sequences. The forgeries show the final result but not the process." Under microscopic examination, the differences became even more obvious. My original brushstrokes showed the natural variations of hand movement, while the forgeries revealed the mechanical precision of someone copying rather than creating. "This painting," Whitmore pointed to one of the storm cloud pieces, "took you 6 weeks to complete. The forger probably finished his version in 6 hours. The emotional authenticity can't be replicated, only approximated." The legal proceedings moved quickly once the evidence was assembled. Donovan's assets were frozen, preventing him from disposing of any remaining originals or fleeing the jurisdiction. Penelope's law license was suspended pending investigation, and Dr. Harmon faced charges for medical fraud and conspiracy. But the emotional recovery took longer. Years of systematic gaslighting had left me questioning every perception, every memory, every instinct. Even with clear evidence of the manipulation, part of me still wondered if I was somehow responsible, if I'd been too trusting or too naive. That's exactly what they wanted you to feel, my therapist explained during one of our sessions. The goal wasn't just financial theft. It was psychological control. They needed you to doubt yourself so completely that you wouldn't resist when they took everything. The therapy sessions helped me understand how the manipulation had worked. The morning coffee ritual created a daily reinforcement of dependency. The gradual introduction of benzodiazepine caused genuine confusion, which Donovan then pointed to as evidence of my declining competence. You weren't imagining the memory problems, Dr. Sarah Chen explained. The drug was causing real cognitive impairment. But the impairment was externally induced, not a sign of mental illness or dementia. Rebuilding my confidence required relearning to trust my own perceptions. I started small, making decisions about what to eat for breakfast or which route to take to the store. Gradually, I worked up to bigger choices: which paintings to include in exhibitions, how to price my work, when to say no to opportunities that didn't feel right. Professor Whitmore became not just a mentor but a guide through the recovery process. His own experience with authentication work had taught him to trust evidence over assumptions, to look for proof rather than accepting surface appearances. The same skills that help you evaluate artwork apply to evaluating people, he said during one of our sessions. Look for consistency between what they say and what they do. Check their story against verifiable facts. Trust the evidence, even when it contradicts what you want to believe. The foundation of our working relationship had been built during what everyone thought were casual visits to his assisted living facility. For 6 months, while he pretended to be confused and declining, he'd been teaching me advanced authentication techniques. The wheelchair was a prop, he admitted later. The facility was real. I do live there for legitimate health reasons, but the dementia was performance. I needed people to underestimate me so I could observe without being noticed. His background in museum authentication work had made him suspicious when I'd first described my concerns about the gallery. The combination of my technical skills and his institutional knowledge created an investigation capability that none of the conspirators had anticipated. You'd described feeling foggy and forgetful, he recalled. But your artistic observations remained sharp and detailed. That suggested external factors rather than internal decline. When you mentioned the morning coffee ritual, I became very interested in your husband's motivations. The assisted living facility had provided perfect cover for our covert collaboration. My weekly visits appeared to be charitable social calls to a lonely elderly man. In reality, we were building a comprehensive case file. The activities room had excellent lighting for examining photographs, Whitmore noted with a slight smile. And the other residents provided natural camouflage for our conversations. Who suspects a confused old man of conducting forensic analysis? Over 6 months, we'd documented every suspicious transaction, every questionable gallery decision, every instance where my recollections differed from Donovan's version of events. The pattern of systematic deception became undeniable once we assembled the evidence chronologically. The key insight, Whitmore explained, was recognizing that your artistic memory was intact while your personal memory was compromised. That suggested selective impairment, most likely chemical rather than neurological. Hair samples taken during the investigation confirmed benzodiazepine exposure consistent with daily low-level dosing over approximately 18 months. The timing matched exactly with the period when I'd started experiencing memory problems and self-doubt. The dosing was sophisticated, the forensic toxicologist explained. Calculated to impair cognitive function without causing obvious intoxication. Someone with medical knowledge definitely helped plan this. Dr. Harmon's involvement had been crucial to the psychological manipulation. His preliminary evaluation, conducted without my knowledge or consent, described a patient exhibiting signs of early cognitive decline. The report was carefully crafted to support a conservatorship petition while maintaining plausible medical deniability. The evaluation was based entirely on second-hand reports from your husband, Dr. Chen explained. He never actually examined you or conducted any legitimate psychological testing. The entire report was fabricated to support the legal strategy. The conservatorship papers would have granted Donovan complete control over my medical care, financial assets, and personal decisions. Under the proposed arrangement, I would have been declared legally incapable of managing my own affairs, effectively becoming a ward of the court with Donovan as my guardian. Once the conservatorship was granted, Morrison explained, you would have had very limited legal recourse. The system is designed to protect vulnerable adults, but it can also be weaponized against competent people by manipulative family members. The investigation revealed that Penelope's law firm had processed dozens of questionable guardianship cases over the past 5 years. The pattern was always similar: older adults or vulnerable individuals who suddenly needed legal protection, with family members conveniently available to serve as guardians. It's a profitable business model, Morrison noted grimly. The guardian controls the assets and can justify almost any expense as necessary for the ward's care. The victims often have limited ability to advocate for themselves or challenge the arrangement. My case was unusual primarily because of the sophisticated documentation system I'd maintained and the involvement of Professor Whitmore. Most artists don't have forensic-level records of their work, and few have access to museum-quality authentication expertise. You were systematically building evidence without realizing it, Whitmore observed. The habits I'd taught you for artistic purposes became the foundation for a legal case. Every photograph, every sketch, every detailed note created a paper trail that couldn't be disputed. The recovery of my original paintings became an international investigation. The network of dealers and collectors who'd purchased the works spanned multiple countries, with some pieces already sold at prestigious auction houses. Art authentication is a specialized field, Morrison explained. There are only a few dozen experts worldwide who can definitively verify the authenticity of contemporary works. Your UV signature system was more sophisticated than anything currently in standard use. Some collectors cooperated voluntarily, returning pieces once they learned of the fraud. Others required legal action, claiming they'd purchased the works in good faith and shouldn't bear the cost of the conspiracy. The art market has limited protections against forgery, the district attorney's office explained. Buyers are often reluctant to return works they've paid for, even when authenticity is questioned. It can take years to recover stolen pieces through civil litigation. But the criminal cases moved more quickly. Donovan pled guilty to multiple felony charges including art fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his attorney recommended accepting a plea deal rather than risking a lengthy trial. The recorded conversations were particularly damaging, his lawyer explained during the sentencing phase. There's no ambiguity about his intent or awareness that his actions were illegal. Penelope fought the charges more aggressively, claiming she'd been manipulated by Donovan and Dr. Harmon. Her defense strategy focused on portraying her as another victim of the conspiracy rather than a primary conspirator. The evidence suggests otherwise, the prosecutor countered. The conservatorship strategy required legal expertise that only Ms. Berry's involvement could provide. The timeline of legal documents shows systematic preparation over many months. Helena Voss, facing federal charges across multiple jurisdictions, eventually cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed the scope of the art fraud network and led to additional arrests in 4 states. The operation was more extensive than we initially realized, Morrison updated me during the proceedings. Your case was just one node in a network that targeted dozens of artists over several years. The financial restitution process proved complex. While the criminal courts could order repayment, actually recovering the stolen money required separate civil litigation against multiple parties in various jurisdictions. Art fraud cases are notoriously difficult to resolve financially, my attorney explained. The works may have been sold multiple times, with each transaction creating additional legal complications. Full recovery can take years. But the criminal justice system moved efficiently once the evidence was presented. Donovan received a 4-year sentence, Penelope 18 months, and Dr. Harmon lost his medical license in addition to serving 2 years in federal prison. The sentences reflect the seriousness of the psychological manipulation, the judge noted during sentencing. This wasn't just financial theft. It was a systematic attempt to destroy another person's identity and autonomy. Helena Voss received the longest sentence, 5 years federal time, for operating a criminal enterprise across state lines. Her cooperation with investigators led to additional prosecutions and helped recover artwork for multiple victims. The network she operated was sophisticated and predatory, the federal prosecutor explained. The victims were chosen specifically because they were talented but vulnerable, with limited business experience or family support. 6 months after the arrests, I stood in the same studio where I'd discovered the betrayal, but everything had changed. The space felt different, larger somehow, as if removing the deception had opened up room I hadn't realized was there. The walls displayed my latest work, pieces I'd created during the recovery process. The paintings were different from my earlier style, bolder and more vibrant, as if the experience had freed something that had been constrained. "Your brushwork has evolved," Professor Whitmore observed, examining a landscape I'd completed the previous week. "There's more confidence in the strokes, less hesitation." He was right. The systematic doubt I'd carried for months had affected even my artistic process, making me second-guess color choices and composition decisions. Now I painted with a clarity I hadn't experienced since art school. Trauma can be transformative, Dr. Chen had explained. Not in a positive way necessarily, but it can strip away illusions and force you to confront reality more directly. Sometimes that leads to authentic creative breakthroughs. The studio now served dual purposes: gallery space and education center. I'd partnered with the local arts council to offer workshops on artist rights, business practices, and fraud prevention. Most artists graduate from school with excellent creative skills but minimal business knowledge, I explained to the first workshop group. That vulnerability makes us attractive targets for exploitation. The sessions covered practical topics: how to document artwork, establish authentication systems, recognize predatory business relationships, and protect intellectual property. But they also addressed the psychological aspects of creative work. Artists often undervalue their own work, I continued. We're taught that financial success somehow compromises artistic integrity. That mindset makes us vulnerable to people who offer to handle the business side while we focus on creating. The workshop participants included painters, sculptors, photographers, and digital artists, ranging from recent graduates to established professionals. Their questions revealed how widespread the problem was. "My gallery takes 60% commission," one painter noted. "Is that normal?" "My husband handles all my contracts," added a sculptor. "Should I be more involved?" A collector offered to buy my entire body of work, shared a photographer. "It seems too good to be true." Each story revealed potential vulnerabilities, opportunities for exploitation that might go unrecognized until too late. The workshops became part education, part group therapy, as participants shared experiences and offered mutual support. Professor Whitmore served as guest lecturer, sharing insights from his authentication work at major museums. His expertise in detecting forgeries translated directly to recognizing fraudulent business practices. "The same skills you use to evaluate artwork apply to evaluating people," he told each group. "Look for consistency, check claims against verifiable facts, and trust evidence over promises." The UV signature technique became a popular workshop topic. I demonstrated how to embed authentication markers in various media, from oil paintings to digital prints to sculptural works. "The technology is simple," I explained, "but the applications are sophisticated. Each marker is unique to the individual piece, creating an authentication system that's extremely difficult to forge." 3 months later, I received a call from the FBI's art crime team. They wanted to consult on developing standardized authentication protocols for contemporary artists. "Your documentation methods and signature system represent current best practices," Special Agent Rodriguez explained. "We're interested in creating educational materials that could be implemented nationally." The meeting took place at the FBI's art crime team headquarters, a specialized unit that investigated cultural property crimes. The conference room walls displayed recovered artwork, pieces that had been stolen, forged, or trafficked before being returned to their rightful owners. Art crime is often connected to other criminal enterprises, Rodriguez noted. Money laundering, organized crime, even terrorism financing. The techniques used in your case appear in contexts far beyond individual fraud. My experience was being studied as a case example of sophisticated art fraud, with particular attention to the psychological manipulation tactics. The combination of chemical impairment, legal coercion, and systematic gaslighting represented an evolution in white-collar crime. Most art fraud involves simple theft or forgery, Dr. Patricia Hayes, the FBI's forensic psychologist, explained. But your case included elements of domestic abuse, elder abuse tactics, and medical fraud. It's a more complex criminal model. The consultation resulted in a partnership to develop educational materials for artists, law enforcement, and legal professionals. The goal was to create awareness about sophisticated fraud schemes while providing practical tools for prevention and detection. Artists need to understand that their creativity makes them valuable targets, Rodriguez emphasized. But they also need practical skills to protect themselves without limiting their artistic development. The first educational seminar took place 6 months later at the National Arts Club in New York. The audience included artists, gallery owners, auction house representatives, and law enforcement officials from across the country. Art authentication is becoming increasingly important as the market grows, I explained to the assembled group. But authentication systems are only useful if artists implement them consistently and understand their legal implications. The presentation covered technical aspects of authentication, legal frameworks for protecting intellectual property, and recognition of common fraud patterns. But the most powerful segment was the personal narrative. I lost more than money, I told the audience. The psychological manipulation made me doubt my own perceptions, my creative judgment, even my sanity. Recovery required rebuilding trust in myself as much as seeking legal justice. The response was overwhelming. Artists shared their own stories of exploitation, legal professionals asked about prosecution strategies, and law enforcement officials requested additional training materials. Your willingness to share this experience is helping prevent similar crimes, Agent Rodriguez noted afterward. Awareness is the most effective prevention tool we have. But the real transformation was personal. Standing in front of that audience, speaking confidently about technical authentication methods and legal strategies, I realized how completely I'd reclaimed my voice. A year earlier, I'd been questioning whether I could trust my own memories. Now I was teaching other professionals how to recognize and combat sophisticated fraud schemes. The foundation that emerged from this work became a national resource. The Barry Whitmore Foundation for Artist Protection provided education, legal referrals, and emergency assistance to artists facing exploitation. We're addressing a gap in the system, Professor Whitmore explained during the Foundation's first board meeting. Artists receive excellent creative training but minimal business education. That imbalance creates vulnerability. The Foundation's first major initiative was developing standardized authentication protocols for emerging artists. Working with technology partners, we created digital certification systems that could be implemented across various media. Every piece of artwork should have a digital fingerprint, our technical director explained. Blockchain-based certificates of authenticity that can't be forged or manipulated. But technology was only part of the solution. The Foundation also focused on education, community building, and psychological support for artists who'd experienced exploitation. Creative people are often isolated, Dr. Chen observed during a Foundation planning session. That isolation makes them attractive targets for manipulative individuals who offer companionship along with business services. The support groups that developed around the Foundation became as important as the technical services. Artists who'd experienced various forms of exploitation found community with others who understood the unique vulnerabilities of creative work. It's not just about money, one participant noted during a group session. When someone steals your art, they're stealing part of your identity. The recovery is emotional as much as financial. 2 years after the initial confrontation in the studio, the transformation was complete but ongoing. The space had evolved into a thriving community center, hosting workshops, exhibitions, and support groups for artists at all career stages. The walls displayed work from dozens of local artists, each piece properly authenticated and fairly priced. But more importantly, they displayed a community commitment to mutual support and protection. "This is what the art world should look like," a visiting curator observed. "Collaborative rather than exploitative, educational rather than mysterious." Professor Whitmore, now officially retired from the assisted living facility and living in a small apartment above the gallery, served as the Foundation's chief authentication officer. His expertise in forensic analysis had found new purpose in protecting living artists rather than just studying historical works. "The work is more satisfying now," he admitted during one of our regular planning sessions. "Instead of solving crimes after they've occurred, we're preventing them from happening in the first place." The investigation had also led to broader reforms in the art authentication industry. Several major auction houses implemented more rigorous verification procedures, and art insurance companies began requiring authentication certificates for high-value contemporary works. "Your case created precedents that are changing industry practices," our attorney explained. "The legal system is adapting to address more sophisticated forms of art fraud." But the most important change was personal. I'd transformed from victim to advocate, from someone who'd been systematically silenced to someone who amplified other voices. "You found your power by helping others find theirs," Dr. Chen observed during one of our final therapy sessions. "That's a remarkable form of healing." The studio that had once felt like a crime scene now buzzed with creative energy. Artists worked side by side, sharing techniques and stories, building the kind of community that makes exploitation impossible. "Safety comes from visibility," I explained to a new workshop group. "When your work and your business practices are transparent, when you're connected to a supportive community, it becomes much harder for predators to isolate and manipulate you." The evening workshops had become particularly popular, drawing artists who worked day jobs and painted in their spare time. These were often the most vulnerable to exploitation, lacking professional networks or business experience. "I've been giving my work away for exposure," one painter admitted. "My boyfriend says I should be grateful anyone wants to display it." "Exposure doesn't pay rent," I replied firmly. "And anyone who tries to convince you that your work has no financial value is usually planning to profit from it themselves." These conversations reminded me of my own journey, the slow erosion of self-worth that had made me susceptible to Donovan's manipulation. The recovery wasn't just about healing from betrayal, it was about rebuilding a sense of professional identity that had been systematically undermined. 3 months later, I received an unexpected call from Helena Voss, the dealer who'd been examining my paintings on that morning when everything changed. She was calling from federal prison, requesting a meeting. "I know I don't deserve your time," she said when I accepted the collect call. "But there are things about the network that never came out in court. Things that might help other artists." The prison meeting room was stark and institutional, fluorescent lighting casting harsh shadows on beige walls. Helena looked smaller than I remembered, her severe silver hair now showing grey roots, her tailored confidence replaced by prison orange. "I want to help," she said without preamble. The network was larger than anyone realized. International connections, money laundering operations, even some legitimate auction houses that were knowingly handling stolen work. Over 2 hours, she detailed a criminal enterprise that spanned continents. Art theft and fraud were just entry points into a much larger economic system that treated creative work as disposable commodity. "Artists were never the real target," she explained. "We were after the money flow. Art is portable, valuable, and difficult to trace. Perfect for moving illegal profits across borders." Her cooperation led to additional investigations and recoveries. 17 more artists were identified as victims, and dozens of stolen works were returned to their creators or estates. The information she provided was invaluable, Agent Rodriguez updated me months later. But it also revealed how much we still don't know about international art crime. The experience reinforced my commitment to the Foundation's educational mission. Individual cases might be resolved through law enforcement, but systemic change required changing the culture around artistic work. We need to professionalize the relationship between artists and the market, I explained to the Foundation's board. Too much of the art world operates on informal agreements and personal relationships. That informality creates opportunities for exploitation. The Foundation's next major initiative focused on developing standardized contracts and business practices for artists at all career levels. Working with entertainment lawyers and intellectual property experts, we created templates that protected creators while remaining accessible to people without legal training. Artists shouldn't need law degrees to protect their work, our legal director emphasized. But they do need to understand the basics of intellectual property, contract negotiation, and business relationships. The contract templates covered everything from gallery representation to commission work to digital licensing. Each document included plain language explanations of legal terms and red flags to watch for in predatory agreements. Knowledge is power, I told each workshop group. But only if you're willing to use it. Don't sign anything you don't understand, and don't let anyone pressure you into quick decisions about your work. 6 months later, the Foundation received its first major grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. The funding supported expanded educational programming and the development of a national database of authentication records. This represents official recognition that artist protection is a cultural priority, Professor Whitmore noted during the grant announcement ceremony. Your personal experience has become a catalyst for systemic change. But the real measure of success was smaller and more personal. Artists who attended our workshops were reporting increased confidence in business negotiations. Several had discovered and prevented exploitation attempts. Others had successfully recovered stolen or misappropriated work. I almost signed a contract giving away all my digital rights, one photographer shared during a follow-up session. But I remembered what you said about reading everything carefully. The clause that seemed like a small detail would have cost me thousands in future licensing fees. These individual victories accumulated into something larger, a shift in how artists approached their professional relationships. Instead of accepting exploitation as inevitable, they were demanding fair treatment and transparent business practices. The art world is changing, a gallery owner observed during an industry panel. Artists are more educated about their rights, more demanding about contracts. It's forcing all of us to be more professional. That professionalization created challenges for legitimate businesses but made it much harder for predators to operate. Educated artists were less likely to accept exploitative terms or ignore red flags in business relationships. Awareness is contagious, Agent Rodriguez noted during our annual consultation meeting. Each artist who learns to protect themselves becomes a resource for others in their community. The Foundation's digital platform had become a gathering place for artists worldwide. The authentication database included works from 47 countries, while the educational forums hosted discussions in 12 languages. Art is universal, I explained to a gathering of international museum directors. But so is exploitation. The techniques used against me in California appear in cases from Sao Paulo to Stockholm. Global problems require global solutions. The international expansion brought new challenges and perspectives. In some countries, artists had even fewer legal protections than in the United States. In others, government support for the arts created different vulnerabilities to exploitation. Cultural context matters, Dr. Chen observed during a Foundation strategy session. But the psychology of manipulation is remarkably consistent across cultures. Predators use the same techniques to isolate victims and undermine their confidence. Working with international partners, the Foundation developed culturally adapted versions of its educational materials. The core principles remained the same: document everything, authenticate work, maintain professional boundaries, but the specific tactics varied based on local legal systems and cultural norms. An artist in Lagos faces different challenges than one in Los Angeles, our international coordinator explained. But they both need to understand their rights and protect their work. By the third anniversary of that confrontation in the studio, the Foundation had directly assisted over 3,000 artists and trained more than 50 law enforcement agencies in art fraud detection. The impact extends far beyond the numbers, Professor Whitmore reflected during the anniversary celebration. You've changed how an entire industry thinks about the relationship between creativity and commerce. The celebration took place in the same studio where everything had begun, but the space was barely recognizable. What had once been a private gallery was now a community center, hosting workshops, exhibitions, and meetings for creative professionals. "This room was where I learned to doubt myself," I told the assembled crowd. "Now it's where other artists learn to trust their instincts and protect their work." The evening included presentations from Foundation Scholarship recipients, artists who'd used grant money to implement authentication systems or recover from exploitation. Their stories illustrated both the ongoing scope of the problem and the effectiveness of education-based solutions. "I was about to sign over exclusive rights to my entire portfolio," one recipient shared. "The Foundation's contract review service helped me understand what I would have been giving up. Instead of losing everything, I negotiated a fair licensing deal that's provided steady income for 2 years." Another recipient had used Foundation resources to recover paintings stolen by a former business partner. "The authentication database proved the works were mine," she explained. "Without that documentation, it would have been impossible to prove ownership." But perhaps the most important presentation came from Dr. Martinez, a researcher who'd been studying the psychological impact of artist exploitation. Her preliminary findings suggested that the Foundation's approach was having measurable effects on creative confidence and professional success. Artists who participate in Foundation programs show significantly lower rates of business-related stress and higher levels of professional self-efficacy, she reported. They're more likely to negotiate fair contracts, less likely to accept exploitative arrangements, and more successful in developing sustainable creative careers. The research validated what I'd observed anecdotally: education and community support were more effective than legal remedies alone in preventing exploitation. "You can't prosecute your way out of a systemic problem," I explained to a gathering of state attorneys general. "But you can educate people to recognize and avoid predatory situations." That principle had guided the Foundation's evolution from a response to personal trauma into a national resource for artist protection. Instead of focusing primarily on criminal justice, we emphasized prevention through education and community building. "The best defense against exploitation is a strong professional network," I told each workshop group. "Predators target isolated individuals. They avoid people who are well-connected and well-informed." The network effects were becoming visible throughout the art community. Artists were sharing information about exploitative galleries, warning each other about predatory contracts, and collaborating on business ventures that prioritized fair treatment. "It's becoming harder to operate unethically in this industry," a reformed gallery owner admitted during an industry conference. "Word spreads quickly when someone mistreats artists. The community is holding us accountable." That accountability extended beyond individual businesses to the institutional structures that governed the art world. Auction houses were implementing more rigorous authentication procedures. Art schools were adding business education to their curricula. Professional organizations were developing ethics standards for galleries and dealers. "Your case created ripple effects throughout the industry," a museum curator observed. "It's no longer acceptable to claim that artists don't need to understand business. Professional development is becoming part of artistic education." The transformation was personal as well as professional. Standing in the studio surrounded by thriving artists, I realized how completely my identity had evolved. 3 years earlier, I'd been a victim, isolated and manipulated. Now I was an advocate, educator, and community leader. "You found your voice by amplifying others," Professor Whitmore observed as the celebration wound down. "That's the most authentic form of healing." The healing hadn't been linear or simple. There were still days when I questioned my judgment, still moments when Donovan's manipulation tactics echoed in my mind. But the community I'd helped build provided constant reinforcement that my perceptions were valid and my voice mattered. "Recovery from systematic manipulation requires systematic support," Dr. Chen had explained early in my therapy. "You need consistent evidence that your thinking is clear and your instincts are trustworthy." The Foundation provided that evidence daily. Every artist who successfully negotiated a fair contract, every recovered stolen work, every prevented exploitation reinforced that the skills and knowledge we were sharing had real value. "This isn't just about preventing crime," I explained to the Foundation's new board members. It's about creating a creative economy that works for creators, not just for the people who profit from their work. That vision was becoming reality throughout the art community. The changes were sometimes subtle but consistently positive: more transparent business practices, better education about rights and contracts, stronger professional networks among artists. The industry is professionalizing, our annual report noted. Artists are demanding accountability, businesses are adapting to meet higher standards, and the result is a more sustainable creative economy. 5 years after stepping out of the shadows in that studio, I stood before a congressional committee investigating exploitation in creative industries. The hearing room was packed with artists, advocates, and industry representatives. Art fraud is not a victimless crime, I testified. When someone steals an artist's work, they're stealing their identity, their voice, their ability to support themselves through creative expression. The committee was considering legislation that would strengthen intellectual property protections for artists and create federal funding for education programs like the Foundation's. The current system places the burden of protection on individual creators, I continued. But systematic problems require systematic solutions. Artists shouldn't have to become lawyers to protect their work. The proposed legislation included provisions for standardized authentication systems, mandatory disclosure of business relationships in art sales, and enhanced penalties for exploitation of creative professionals. This isn't about restricting the art market, I clarified in response to industry criticism. It's about creating transparency and accountability that will ultimately benefit everyone. The hearing generated national media attention and reinvigorated discussions about artist rights. Major news outlets ran features about art fraud, professional organizations issued statements supporting stronger protections, and law schools began developing specializations in cultural property law. Your testimony crystallized issues that have been bubbling under the surface for years, a cultural policy researcher noted. It's forcing the industry to confront problems it's been ignoring. But the most meaningful response came from individual artists who reached out to share their own stories. Messages arrived from around the world, describing exploitation attempts, successful recoveries, and prevention strategies inspired by the Foundation's work. Reading about your experience gave me courage to report my gallery for selling my work without permission, one artist wrote from Australia. The investigation led to charges and recovery of several pieces I thought were lost forever. I almost signed a contract that would have given away all my rights, another noted from Canada. But I remembered your advice about reading everything carefully. I'm so glad I trusted my instincts instead of the pressure to sign quickly. These individual victories accumulated into something larger, a cultural shift toward recognizing creative work as valuable intellectual property deserving of protection and fair compensation. Artists are no longer willing to accept exploitation as the price of creative expression, an industry analyst observed. That's forcing fundamental changes in how the art world operates. The congressional legislation passed 6 months later, providing federal funding for artist education programs and establishing standardized authentication requirements for publicly funded arts organizations. This represents official recognition that artist protection is a cultural priority, Senator Williams noted during the signing ceremony. We're creating systems that support creativity rather than exploit it. But the real celebration took place back in the studio, surrounded by the community that had grown from a moment of betrayal into a movement for systemic change. We did this together, I told the assembled artists, educators, and advocates. Individual trauma became collective action. Personal healing became professional transformation. The space that had once witnessed my deepest betrayal now hosted my greatest triumph, a room full of artists who understood their worth, protected their work, and supported each other's success. This is what the art world should look like, Professor Whitmore observed, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a long career well completed. Collaborative, educational, protective of creativity rather than exploitative of creators. Looking around the room, I saw faces that represented every stage of artistic development and every form of creative expression. Painters and sculptors, photographers and digital artists, emerging creators and established professionals, all united by a commitment to fair treatment and mutual support. You asked me once how I learned to trust my instincts, I said to a young artist who'd been attending workshops for months. The truth is, I had to learn that trusting yourself isn't selfish. It's essential. When you protect your own work, you're protecting the value of all creative expression. The evening ended with a ritual that had become traditional at foundation events. Each artist shared one lesson they'd learned or one success they'd achieved since joining the community. I learned to read contracts carefully, one painter shared. It saved me from signing away my digital rights. I discovered my work was worth more than I thought, added a sculptor. Proper pricing meant I could afford to keep creating. I found a community that supports my success instead of exploiting my vulnerabilities, concluded a photographer. As the last participants filtered out into the night, I remained in the studio with Professor Whitmore, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of transformation. Do you ever regret it? He asked quietly. The marriage, the trust, the years before you knew what was happening. I considered the question carefully, looking around the space that had become home to so many creative dreams and professional aspirations. I regret the betrayal, I said finally. But I don't regret the journey. Without experiencing exploitation, I never would have understood how to prevent it. Without losing my voice, I never would have learned how to amplify others. He nodded thoughtfully. Wisdom often comes through difficult experience. The key is transforming pain into purpose. That transformation was visible throughout the room, walls covered with authentic work fairly priced and properly credited, computers loaded with educational materials freely shared, filing cabinets full of documentation that protected rather than prosecuted. We turned a crime scene into a community center, I observed. We transformed individual trauma into collective strength. The foundation's impact extended far beyond the physical space. Online platforms connected artists internationally, educational materials had been translated into dozens of languages, and authentication systems protected works in museums and galleries worldwide. The ripple effects continue expanding, Professor Whitmore noted. Each artist you educate becomes an educator. Each exploitation prevented protects not just one creator but everyone in their network. 6 months later, I stood in a different kind of space, a federal courtroom where Helena Voss was being sentenced for her role in the international art fraud network. Your cooperation has been valuable, the judge acknowledged, but the harm you caused was extensive and systematic. She received a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony that had led to additional prosecutions and recoveries, but she would still serve 3 years in federal prison. As she was led away, she turned to look at me one final time. I hope you understand that I never intended personal harm, she said quietly. Intent doesn't determine impact, I replied. But acknowledgement can be part of healing. The courtroom proceedings represented the end of the criminal justice phase of my experience, but the beginning of something larger. The precedents established by these prosecutions were being used to pursue similar cases nationwide. Art fraud prosecutions have increased by 40% since your case, Agent Rodriguez informed me afterward. The techniques and evidence standards you helped develop are being applied internationally. But the most important developments were happening in creative communities rather than courtrooms. Artists were organizing, educating themselves, and demanding accountability from the institutions that claimed to serve them. The balance of power is shifting, an industry observer noted. Artists are no longer willing to accept unfair treatment as inevitable. That shift was visible in every aspect of the art world: galleries implementing transparent pricing practices, auction houses requiring rigorous authentication, art schools teaching business skills alongside creative techniques. Your experience catalyzed changes that were overdue, a museum director acknowledged. The industry is becoming more professional and more ethical. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than institutional. Artists were developing a sense of collective identity and mutual support that made individual exploitation much more difficult. We protect each other now, one foundation member noted during a community meeting. When someone targets one of us, they face resistance from all of us. That collective resistance was visible in the success stories that filled the foundation's files: exploitative galleries closed by community boycotts, predatory contracts exposed through social media campaigns, stolen works recovered through collaborative investigation. Isolation enables exploitation, I explained to a gathering of art educators. Community prevents it. The most important thing we can teach emerging artists is that they don't have to navigate the professional world alone. The educational programs had evolved to emphasize community building as much as individual protection. Workshop participants formed ongoing support networks, sharing resources and experiences long after completing formal training. It's not enough to know your rights, I told each new group. You need connections to people who will help you enforce them. Those connections were changing the fundamental dynamics of the art world. Instead of isolated individuals facing powerful institutions, artists were organizing into informed communities capable of collective action. The transformation has been remarkable, Professor Whitmore observed as we reviewed the Foundation's 5-year impact report. You've created a movement that extends far beyond your personal experience. The report documented measurable changes in artist income, contract negotiations, and fraud prevention. But the statistics couldn't capture the most important transformation: thousands of artists who now approach their professional relationships with confidence and knowledge instead of fear and naivety. We changed the conversation, I reflected, looking through testimonials from artists whose careers had been protected or enhanced through foundation programs. Instead of accepting exploitation as inevitable, we're demanding accountability and achieving results. The conversation was happening in studios and galleries, art schools and auction houses, wherever creative work intersected with commercial interests. Artists were asking harder questions, negotiating better terms, and supporting each other's success. This is what sustainability looks like in the creative economy, our annual report concluded. Not individual artists struggling in isolation, but informed communities working together to protect and promote authentic creative expression. 7 years after that confrontation in the studio, I stood in the same space preparing for another kind of revelation. The Foundation had been selected to receive the National Arts Education Award, recognizing its impact on creative professional development. The ceremony will be broadcast nationally, our communications director noted. It's an opportunity to reach artists who still don't know these resources exist. But the real celebration was quieter and more personal. Professor Whitmore, now 91, had asked to present the award himself. "You taught me that wisdom comes through sharing," he said as we prepared for the ceremony. "What you've built here represents everything I hoped to achieve through decades of authentication work." His presence at the ceremony would mark his final public appearance before retiring completely. The symbolic weight of that transition felt appropriate, one generation of expertise passing responsibility to the next. "The work continues," he said simply. "The foundation you've built will protect artists long after both of us are gone." The award ceremony took place in the studio, transformed for the evening into a showcase of community achievement. Representatives from 40 states attended, along with international delegates and federal officials. "The Barry Whitmore Foundation has revolutionized artist protection," the presenter announced. "Through education, community building, and advocacy, it has created lasting change in how creative professionals understand and protect their rights." But the most meaningful moment came during my acceptance speech, when I looked out at an audience filled with artists whose careers had been protected or enhanced through foundation programs. "This award represents collective achievement," I said. "Every artist who learned to authenticate their work, every recovery of stolen pieces, every prevented exploitation contributed to this recognition." The applause that followed wasn't just for the foundation or for me personally. It was recognition of a community that had transformed individual vulnerability into collective strength. "We proved that systematic problems require systematic solutions," I continued. "That education and community building are more powerful than individual legal remedies. That artists deserve professional respect and protection." After the ceremony, as the last guests departed, I found myself alone in the studio with Professor Whitmore. The space that had witnessed so much transformation over the years felt electric with possibility. "What's next?" he asked, settling into the chair by the window where he'd spent countless hours teaching and mentoring. I looked around the room, thinking about the thousands of artists whose lives had been touched by this work, the international network of protection and support that had grown from a moment of personal crisis. The work continues, I said, echoing his earlier words. There are still artists being exploited, still systems that prioritize profit over creativity, still communities that need education and support. He smiled, the expression carrying decades of satisfaction at work well done. Then you know what to do. Outside the studio windows, the arts district had transformed along with the broader creative community. Galleries displayed clear pricing and provenance information. Studios hosted regular educational workshops. Artists collaborated openly instead of competing desperately. We didn't just recover from exploitation, I observed. We created something better than what existed before. That creation was visible throughout the community. Artists who understood their worth, businesses that operated ethically, institutions that supported rather than exploited creativity. This is what healing looks like, I said to myself, watching late-night pedestrians browse gallery windows with confidence and knowledge. Not just personal recovery, but systemic transformation. The journey from victim to advocate, from isolation to community leadership, from doubt to certainty had required years of work. But standing in that studio, surrounded by evidence of collective achievement, I knew the effort had been worthwhile. We made ourselves unforgettable, I said quietly, by making sure others would never be invisible. Have you ever had someone try to erase your talents, convince you that your instincts were wrong, make you doubt your own worth? Have you ever discovered that your biggest vulnerability was actually your greatest source of strength? Have you ever been the only one who stayed when others walked away, only to realize you were exactly where you needed to be? Tell me your story in the comments. Because every voice matters, every experience counts, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is step out of the shadows together, transforming individual pain into collective purpose, personal healing into professional revolution. The art of becoming visible isn't just about being seen. It's about creating space for others to be seen too. And that, more than any painting I've ever created, is the masterpiece I'm most proud of.